Yo, what's going on? Hope you are doing well. Today we will be deep diving into my bike setup on my custom built Ibis HD6, which I have been absolutely thrashing for the last 2 months and a bit now. I've really enjoyed the bike. I've had the opportunity to test out some really cool new parts from RaceFace and Marzocchi on this thing. And through my time of setting up this bike, I've tried a variety of different suspension settings, and I found this bike to actually work the best with the suspension as fast as it can go with the rebound, which is something I've not experienced before. But we'll discuss that later in the video, so let's get into it. To start things off, let's take a look at the frame. For me, I went for the size 2, which is a reach of 454 millimeters. I am 5 foot 11 inches tall, or 183.3 centimeters. And through a whole boatload of testing of a wide range of bikes, I've generally found that I prefer bikes with a reach of 455 millimeters to about 465. So that kind of 10 millimeter range, typically seems to be my sweet spot, with a bit of give or take on either end of that. And yeah, this bike's been on the smaller side, of course, at 454, but it's been really great on the playful side. And I think that the more playful nature of the smaller bike really comes out in my latest film called Illuminance, which went live last week. It's a fun self-filmed video that I put out, all riding the HD6. That will be linked down in the description if you'd like to check it out. Looking at the other frame sizes available from Ibis, if I were to go up a size, it would be the size 3, which comes in at a reach of 480 millimeters, which would be, I think, the biggest bike I've actually ever built. So I was a little bit worried about that. I do think that with proper cockpit setup, so a high-rise bar, a lot of spacers, maybe some back roll, potentially shorter stem, I think I could make a 480 millimeter reach bike work. And obviously with that, you'd get the benefit of the longer wheelbase. So in general, that could be a good theory, but the 454 mil bike just sounded a little bit more playful and fun for me, which is just why I went for that. Now with that said, I did just purchase a slightly longer bike than I typically ride. So I have a trail bike, 120, 140 bike, which I'll tease in a second, that has a 470 millimeter reach. So I'm gonna use that as a bit of a stepping stone, kind of moving into the future to see if I like the longer wheelbases as opposed to the shorter wheelbase, shorter reach bikes that I've tended to ride in the past. To further elaborate on the point that I just brought up about going to a larger frame size to get the benefit of a longer wheelbase, I just thought that it's worth noting that the Ibis HD6, all of the sizes have a 435 mil chainstay length, which is a solid length, pretty modest, not too long, not too short. However, going up in frame size will get you the longer wheelbase from just going forwards with the front end, not the back end. So just something I thought was worth mentioning. On the contrary, the trail bike I did just buy, going from a medium to a large, did actually get me a longer chainstay length. So there is a bit more of a benefit in going up in frame size for wheelbase, depending on how brands go about their chainstay length. So just something that is worth taking a look at the next time that you buy a bike. And with that, here's a quick little tease on the next bike build. There you have it. We'll leave it there for now. So moving on from frame size, let's take a look at the next most important part of the bike, in my opinion, which is the suspension. Looking at the front of the bike, we've got the new Super Z from Marzocchi in the gloss black, looking too clean, and I have had such a positive experience on this fork. I actually got a prototype version a few weeks prior to the public release, and now I am on the production model, and it is running so good. Got 74 PSI in there with 2 volume spacers. I had spent a ton of time on the Z1 in the past. I've tried both the air and coil versions of that fork, but I've spent the majority of my time on the air version. And with that fork, I generally ran that damper all the way open just to get the most supple feel as I could off the top. And because of that, my tuning was all down to my air spring. So how much PSI and how many volume spacers. So going into my first couple rides on the Super Z, I felt really confident on setting up the air spring and could just really focus on the difference I was feeling with the GripX damper. And I've had a really good experience with it. I'm running 10 clicks from closed on high and low speed. And I've tried realistically the whole range of all the clicks, and you don't really lose that top end feel, the suppleness, and just really impressed. Great fork, very, very stoked on it. Good job, Marzo. Moving on from the Super Z up front, let's take a look at the rear shock situation. I've ran both the Bomber CR, which is mounted up right now, and the Bomber Air on this bike, so both coil and air. I've had a positive experience with both, and that is due to the leverage rate of this bike. So from my understanding of people who have put this bike into Linkage X3, which is a really cool program, you can plot the pivot points of the bike, enter some geometry numbers, and as a result, the program will give you a rough understanding of the kinematic and how the suspension works, which is really, really helpful. Now, The numbers I'm about to reference were from Linkage X3 and I'm assuming are not the most accurate ever. These are not from Ibis. And generally brands do not put these types of things out there. So this is all just kind of from my general research of trying to set the bike up as best I can. But from my research, this bike has about a 30% progression ratio, which is pretty ideal for a coil. And additionally, from what it looks like, the last 25 millimeters of the rear shock stroke do get more progressive. So there's a bit of a ramp up built into the kinematic, which is also great for a coil and running less of a volume spacer in an air shock. So now let's break down my experience with each of those two shocks. Beginning with the Bomber Air, because that is the shock that I originally built up this bike with. I'm running that thing at 180 PSI, got the 0.4 volume spacer in there, and I run it with the compression all the way open or just a quarter of the turn closed. I originally started off with the 0.2 volume spacer, as that is what came stock in my shock. And that felt good. I definitely was having to go up a little bit more in PSI than I wanted to get the bottoming resistance. So essentially I was just running a pretty low sag figure, which is totally fine. And I could compensate by just kind of chilling out my riding, but going to the 0.4 gave me that extra bottoming resistance, good top end feel, just allowed me to get a little bit wild with some good bottoming resistance. So that's kind of the philosophy there. Now in the Bomber Air spacer pack, there is also a 0.6 spacer and a 0.8. Now, I had those old bikes that have since moved on to some friends of mine. So the last spacer I had bigger than the 0.4 was a 1.0. So I tried that too, because why not? And with the 1.0 spacer, the bike was super spiky and unstable. So wouldn't really recommend that, at least from my experience. You know, with a 30% progression, the 0.4 spacer was awesome. Gives me all the bottoming that I could really want, in the 180 PSI spring rate felt awesome. So that is the general settings of that shock. Moving on to rebound, I've got the Bomber Air and the Bomber CR wide open, as fast as those puppies will go. And I've got the Super Z wide open, as fast as it can go. So my rationale for this is I was riding my normal lap that I've been riding all spring at Grafton Mesa. I'll put some B-roll of the trail up on the screen right now. It's a pretty rocky trail. I did 3 laps, it's 9 miles per lap. So I'd say by the last lap, I was pretty tired, to be honest with you. In the first 2 laps, I was at a click faster than the recommended rebound from Marzo for the fork and shock. I had the Bomber Air on that day. And typically about 1 click faster than recommended is right where I like to be in past experiences. Now, for my 3rd lap, I was like, I might as well change something, because my first 2 laps were constant settings. So I went up 2 clicks on the fork and shock, and even though I was the most tired on the 3rd lap, my bike felt like an absolute dream, and I rode the best I had ridden the whole day. So I was like, all right, I think I'm onto something here. After the positive experience of opening up the shock by 2 clicks as well as the fork, I went back to that same trail, did my first lap on those same settings. Second lap, I went up 2 clicks again in the shock and 2 clicks again in the fork. That put me at wide open at the shock and just under wide open at the fork. And it just kept feeling better. So I was super stoked. Now, after that ride, I was like, all right, I'm just gonna open up the fork all the way and see how it feels on some other trails. And it just kept feeling good, and I haven't had to touch it. I talked briefly with my Marzo team manager, who's a super awesome guy. And he brought up the fact that for the rear shock, the wide open setting might be due to the fact that the DW Link, there's kind of more to move in the rear suspension as opposed to a single pivot bike or a horse link bike. So because of that, I might need more rebound just to get the bike to work its best. Now the fork, I might just be crazy, but I'll touch on that more in a second. So anyways, that's kind of my rationale of how I got to being wide open on the fork and shock for the rebound. Now, it's just so happened that during my time of riding the HD6 and really trying to optimize its setup, I have also been reading Racetech's Motorcycle Suspension Bible, which is all about suspension setup. And the chapter on rebound was really, really eye-opening to me. The overarching kind of concept was that your maximum feeling of traction and maximum feeling of control are not at the same point. So let me read you 2 quotes from the book that really stood out to me. All right, so here are the 2 quotes. Therefore, at the highest point of traction, the bike will wiggle around a little more than feels comfortable for many riders. Then the next quote is, now if the rider can get used to a little looser feeling, the gains in traction will improve lap times and tire life, and his ideal feel peak will be closer to the traction peak. So essentially, my kind of thought process is, if I can just learn to ride a bike with really, really fast rebound, yes, it may be uncomfortable at first, but there's really only benefits to be had. Yes, rebound will be detrimental to a certain point, but at least with stock tuning in the Super Z and the Bomber CR, I don't feel like going all the way open is going to get me to a point of diminishing returns. Yes, I would like to get a lighter rebound tune for both the fork and the shock to try to go even faster, and at that point I may be to the point of diminishing returns, but at least for now, if I can learn to ride this bike with the rebound as fast as it can go, I really only see benefits. With that said, I might look back on this video in like 2 months and be like, yo, that guy was crazy, but at least for right now, that's my general philosophy. Here's a quick look at the chart provided by the book. So this is in relation to rebound damping. So less damping, which is faster, more damping, which is slower. And then here you have your maximum traction, so favoring the faster side, then your maximum feeling of control, favoring the slower side. So that's kind of what those quotes are talking about. This is the book. It's been really amazing to read, and I'd really recommend picking up a copy if you are a bike nerd like me. To further elaborate on what I just showed, the looser feeling that is described in those quotes that I read from the book, that's in relation to rebound, so the faster rebound feeling looser. There is also a part of the book about compression, but the looser is not in regards to compression, it is in regards simply to rebound in this instance. Now that we've gone through my rebound setup, let's take a look at how I have the Bomber CR setup, which is actually the shock currently mounted up on the bike. So I've got this thing with the 450 pound coil. I originally started out with a 400, and that is because I used the JTech suspension calculator. I think I put in about 30% sag, and it said I should use the 400. Now, when I measured, the 400 actually did put me at about 30% sag, so they're on the money there, but it just wasn't enough bottoming resistance. So bumped up to the 450, it was feeling mint. I have also tried the 500, just out of curiosity. 500 was too stiff, felt really harsh off the top. So 450, now you may be wondering, like, yo, you were just saying with the 0.2 volume spacer in the Bomber Air, you were bottoming out, like what's going on with the coil on there? So for me, I have found in a huge day of testing yesterday actually at the bike park at Bryan Head in Utah, which is really rocky, there were huge traction benefits with the coil on this bike. Like I was in love with how I was feeling. So if I'm not riding jumps, drops, and things, I'm gonna have a coil on this. I think I'll have a coil on it about as much as I can. And I'll only put the air shock on if I'm gonna be hitting some high, harsh impacts. So coil feels good, but I do have to adjust my riding accordingly. That's all for the suspension portion of this video. One last note is I'm still playing with my compression settings on the Bomber CR, so I don't have a definitive number of clicks to provide. Right now I have it at 4 from all the way open, which is about 10 from closed. So still playing with that. So in the future, I'll add it down in the comments. But let's move on to the drivetrain. I've got the XTR 1051 cassette, the bigger of the cassettes because I've been hitting some pretty steep climbs. On other bikes, I have ran the 10-45 cassette, which is great. Gives you a shorter chain length, keeps things tidy, but 1051 for practicality on this bike is working mint. And I've actually got this cool little thing I'm doing with my shifting setup right now. So I'll explain. All right, so we're gonna take a look at the derailleur and we're gonna be discussing B-tension. I got this technique from BK on Instagram. I'll put his username up on the screen right now. He's a super great follow if you're a bike nerd, but essentially you shift into your second gear and you approximately align your top pulley wheel with the first gear cog. Now you can see I have a bit more distance than that. So what you do is you start with the wheel approximately in line with the first gear, then shift from second to first and adjust your B tension, so screw it in by about a half a turn until you stop hearing some grinding. So that got me to about this setting, which is very little B tension compared to how you're supposed to set up your B tension. Now, because of this, I actually got to take a link out of my chain, which was pretty darn exciting. So this is just a new technique I'm testing. So far, the shifting performance has been great, and that's kind of the whole philosophy with it, is this gets you your guide wheel, so the top wheel, closer to your cassette, which will get you more precise shifting. So I'm gonna do a few more bikes with the same technique, and I'll talk more about this technique in future videos as time goes on. Looking at my wheels, we've got the aluminum RaceFace Turbine wheels. These came out last year, and I have spent a ton of time on them between a short travel trail bike last season and the HD6 this season. I really don't have enough good things to say about these wheels. I really enjoy them. They have different rim profiles for the front and rear for improved compliance, and They're just super great. And paired to those, I've got Maxxis tires, Assegai up front, DHR2 rear, both in the double down casing and max grip compound. Moving back up to the front of the bike for brakes, we've got the XTR brakes. I love these things. The modulation is really great in my opinion. I'm running them with the resin pads to increase that modulation, and I find that with proper body posture when braking, the resin pads are totally fine. I run resin pads in Saint brakes on my freeride bike, and I ride a lot of the steepest trails that we have here in southern Utah by the Rampage sites, and the resin pads give me plenty of braking power. And I run those with 200 mil rotors on the downhill bike, of course. On this bike, we got 200 mil rotor in the front, 180 mil rotor in the rear, and both are 4-piston. Super great brake setup, love it. Staying up at the front of the bike, we've got the 40 millimeter RaceFace Turbine stem in orange, looking pretty nice in my opinion with that orange frame. Now, paired to that stem, we've got the new RaceFace Turbine handlebar, 35 mil clamp, 40 mil rise, 760 mil width. These bars come with specific and 20 millimeter increments to give you the best compliance out there on the trail. I think that's super rad. And lastly, we've got the new RaceFace Chester grips in the 34 millimeter diameter. So the bigger of the two options. The other option is the 31, which I actually built up this bike with, but I do prefer the 34. So yeah, that's the Cockpit setup, and it's feeling super nice. Starting to wrap things up here, we've got the 200 mil Fox transfer dropper. Pretty cool that the 200 mil post fits pretty well in the size 2 frame. Doesn't slam all the way, but gets a pretty good amount down there if you're looking to run a fairly low seat and also have a lot of drop. Personally, I have mine up by about 2.5, 3 inches, and the 200 mil length works really well for my legs. And then we've got the ES1 saddle paired to that from Tidal. Few last notes before we wrap up this video. We are running one 15 mil spacer up front, which is pretty low, and we've got a pretty short head tube, but the 40 millimeter rise kind of makes up for all of that. If you watch the bike build, you will have seen I did do electrical shrink wrap where all of the cables enter and exit the frame, so cool little touch there, I would say. If you'd like to watch the bike build, it'll be linked down in the description. And then in the back, I just added some extra mastic tape where some cables were hitting, so this derailleur cable was hitting the frame, so toss them there. Toss a couple extra pieces on the chain slap protector, and there we have it, my custom built HD6. That's all for this breakdown on my custom built Ibis HD6. Thank you to Ibis for sending me this frame to ride for the season. I'm not a sponsored athlete by Ibis by any means, but they did just send me this bike to ride. I've been pretty stoked on it, and it's been fun to learn a new platform. If you have any questions about anything I mentioned in the video, please drop them down below. I'll definitely get back to you, and we'll catch you in the next video. Peace.